The 5 men were not prepared for the mountains that night. They carried no winter gear, no emergency supplies, and no reason to fear the road ahead. They were simply driving home after a basketball game in Northern California. But somewhere after midnight, their familiar route disappeared, replaced by darkness, snow, and silence. What happened after they left the road has never been fully explained. On the night of February 24th, 1978, 5 friends were on their way home from a college basketball game in Chico, California. The game was over, the crowd dispersed, and the town slowly disappeared behind them as their car moved into the surrounding darkness. The road stretched ahead, quiet and familiar. They followed the route they had taken many times before, confident it would carry them safely back. The farther they drove from the city, the fewer lights remained. Buildings gave way to open land, and traffic thinned until the road felt almost empty. The night was cold, but calm. The pavement reflected the glow of the headlights as the car continued forward, mile after mile, with no sense of urgency and no hint of trouble. This was supposed to be a simple drive, one last stretch of road before home. Somewhere along the way, the surroundings began to change. The road narrowed, streetlights became scarce. The landscape rose gently, lifting them away from the familiar lowlands and toward darker, quieter ground. Still, nothing seemed wrong. The car kept moving, and the road kept leading them onward. They did not realize they were leaving their known route behind. By the time the darkness felt heavier and the trees closed in closer on either side, they were already too far along to notice exactly when everything had shifted. And still, they drove on. The road continued to climb. Trees closed in, their branches forming dark shapes beyond the reach of the headlights. Snow appeared in thin patches along the shoulder, then in thicker stretches that reflected the light with a dull, icy glow. The air inside the car grew quieter, not because anyone spoke of fear, but because the surroundings no longer invited conversation. The radio crackled, losing its signal as the car moved higher. Jack adjusted the dial, then turned it off entirely. The only sounds left were the engine, the tires against the pavement, and the occasional rush of wind through the trees. They walked uphill, into deeper snow, into thicker forest, into colder, higher ground. No clear reason explains why they left the car behind. With effort, it could have been pushed free. With patience, they could have waited for daylight. With the engine running, they could have stayed warm. Yet none of these choices were made. Instead, they disappeared into the mountains on foot, carrying little with them, dressed for an ordinary night, not for survival. By morning, Snow had begun to cover their tracks. Back in the towns below, families waited. When the men did not return home, concern grew slowly at first, then rapidly. Phone calls were made. Routes were checked. Authorities were notified. Search teams began to trace the roads they should have taken. But the mountains kept their silence. Days passed, then weeks. The forest showed no sign of the 5 men who had walked into it. Only the endless stretch of trees and snow, unmoved by questions or time. And somewhere in that vast, frozen landscape, the men were still moving, or had already stopped. When the car was finally found, it sat alone in the mountains, as if it had been deliberately placed there. Snow surrounded it, pressed flat by wind and time. The road it rested on was remote, rarely used in winter, and far from any logical route the men would have taken. Searchers expected to find damage. There was none. The engine started. The fuel tank still held gas. The battery was alive. Nothing about the vehicle suggested it had failed them. Investigators noted that with several people pushing, the car could likely have been freed from the shallow snow that trapped it. There was no sign that such an attempt had been made. Inside, everything looked ordinary. Candy wrappers lay where they had been dropped. Personal belongings remained. The car doors were unlocked. One window was partially rolled down, allowing cold mountain air to move freely through the interior. Outside, faint footprints led away from the vehicle. Search teams followed them as long as they could, 5 sets at first, moving together. Then the snow thickened. Wind erased details. Soon, the trail vanished entirely, swallowed by the landscape. Helicopters circled overhead. Volunteers formed lines and walked the forest floor. Dogs were brought in, then called back when conditions grew too harsh. The mountains offered no clear direction, no signs of shelter, no answers. Weeks passed, then months. Winter slowly loosened its grip, and when the snow began to retreat, the forest revealed what it had been hiding. Nearly 20 miles from the abandoned car, searchers came upon a small Forest Service trailer tucked quietly among the trees. It was not visible from the road. It was not easy to reach. It stood as a place one would only find if they were already deep within the mountains. Inside, they found Ted Weir. He lay on a bed, wrapped carefully in blankets. His body was thin, almost unrecognizable, his beard long and untrimmed. Evidence suggested he had been alive inside the trailer for weeks, possibly months after the others had perished. The trailer had shelter, it had warmth, it had supplies. There were canned foods stored inside. Some had been opened. Others remained untouched. A can opener sat nearby, clean and unused. Ted had lost an extreme amount of weight. He had starved, slowly, while food remained within reach. Why he did not eat remains unknown. Nearby, scattered in the forest, searchers found the remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling. Both had died from exposure, their bodies telling the quiet story of cold and exhaustion. Not far from them, Jackie Hewitt's shoes were discovered, placed side by side. Jackie himself was gone. The pattern made no sense. The distances between discoveries did not align with normal survival behavior. The choices did not follow logic or instinct, and one man was still missing: Gary Mathias. What happened after the men left the car did not happen all at once. The mountains did not react quickly. They did not rush the moment. Time there stretched and folded in on itself, shaped by cold, darkness, and exhaustion. Snow fell steadily, sometimes lightly, sometimes in thick, silent sheets that reshaped the ground hour by hour. Footprints that once marked direction softened, blurred, and vanished. Sound did not travel far. Voices were swallowed by trees. Even the wind moved cautiously, as if careful not to disturb what was unfolding. Later, investigators would try to compress this stretch of time into numbers. Hours without shelter. Miles walked in freezing temperatures. The rate at which the human body loses heat, but those calculations could not capture what truly mattered: the space between moments. The long, quiet intervals when the men were still alive, still thinking, still choosing where to step next. Somewhere after leaving the car, the group separated. There is no evidence of panic, no signs of a sudden argument or struggle. It does not appear that anyone ran. Instead, the separation seems to have happened slowly, almost naturally. One man would have slowed, another moved ahead. The snow grew deeper. The incline became steeper. Breath grew shorter. Voices that once stayed close began to fade between the trees. In the dark, distance feels larger than it is. Ted Weir eventually reached the Forest Service trailer. How he found it remains one of the most unsettling questions of the case. The trailer was not visible from the road. It was not clearly marked. It stood tucked among trees off any obvious path. A person unfamiliar with the area would not easily stumble upon it by chance. Yet Ted found it. He opened the door. He stepped inside. For a time, he survived. Inside the trailer, the signs he left behind spoke quietly. Blankets had been arranged, not torn apart. There was no evidence of panic or destruction. Ted attempted to keep himself warm. He moved with care, conserving energy, enduring rather than fighting. Some food had been opened, but much remained untouched. A can opener sat nearby, unused. This detail troubled investigators deeply. Ted did not die quickly. He lived long enough for his beard to grow thick and uneven, long enough for his body to waste away slowly, long enough for someone else, possibly Gary, to have entered the trailer after him. There were indications that another person had been present. Items slightly displaced, food moved, small changes that suggested interaction rather than isolation. Yet nothing remained clear enough to confirm it. Outside the trailer, the mountains continued to claim the others. Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling did not reach shelter. Their remains were later found miles apart, suggesting movement rather than collapse. They had kept going, step after step, even as their strength failed. The cold left its marks slowly. There were no signs of violence, only exhaustion, exposure, and time. Jackie Hewitt's shoes were found placed neatly together, not scattered, not discarded in haste. Carefully positioned side by side in the snow. Why he removed them remains unexplained. Why he placed them with such precision remains even harder to understand. And why he never reached the trailer, despite being closer to it than the others, has never been answered. Then there was Gary Mathias. Gary stood apart in every theory. He was stronger, more independent, familiar with outdoor terrain. If anyone could have moved between locations, carried supplies, or attempted to find help, it would have been him. Some investigators believe Gary may have tried to assist Ted, leaving the trailer repeatedly, growing weaker each time. Others believe he set out alone, convinced he could reach a road, a light, or another sign of civilization. No trace of him was ever found. Years passed. Searches ended. Files were closed. Evidence degraded under time and weather. Witness memories faded. But the gap between known events remained, an empty stretch of time where something happened. Something that caused 5 men to leave a working car and walk willingly into the mountains without a clear reason. Even now, the question lingers in that space between facts. What did they experience on that road before the car stopped? Fear? Confusion? Disorientation? Or something they could not explain but felt compelled to follow? The mountains offer no answers. They only remain. When the searches finally ended, it was not because everything had been found. It was because there was nothing left to search. The mountains had been combed again and again. Helicopters traced the same paths through the sky. Volunteers walked the same frozen ground until their legs ached and their voices grew hoarse. Each season returned the same silence. Snow fell, snow melted. The forest reset itself without ceremony. The case files grew thick, then stagnant. Investigators reviewed the evidence one final time. The working car, the uphill walk, the shelter reached too late, the food left uneaten, the shoes placed neatly in the snow, the man who vanished without leaving a single trace. Each fact existed on its own, solid and undeniable. Together, they refused to form a complete picture. No theory could explain everything. If the men were confused, why were their actions so deliberate? If fear drove them, why was there no panic? If survival guided them, why were survival tools ignored? The timeline between leaving the car and their final moments remained fractured, filled with gaps where decisions were made but never witnessed. Those hours, those days, existed only in imagination, stretched thin across snow and distance. Families were left with fragments instead of closure. They remembered the men as they were before the mountains, routine, predictable, gentle. They remembered laughter, schedules, habits, small details that no investigation could replace. For them, the story did not end in the forest. It continued quietly, carried through years of unanswered questions. Gary Mathias remained missing. His absence became the center of the mystery, the unanswered variable that prevented resolution. Without him, the story could not close. Without knowing where he went, or why, every theory remained incomplete. He existed only in speculation, imagined walking deeper into the trees, searching for light, or turning back too late. The Forest Service trailer was eventually reclaimed by time. Snow buried it each winter. Animals moved through it. Wind rattled its walls. It became just another structure in the woods, stripped of meaning by those who did not know what had happened inside. The road where the car was found still exists. It is quiet, narrow, unremarkable. Most people who pass through it do not stop. They do not know what occurred there, or how easily an ordinary night slipped into something unknowable. The mountains do not mark the place. There is no warning, no sign that something went wrong. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part. Nothing about the night announced itself as dangerous. 5 men left a basketball game. They got into a car. They drove into the dark. At some point, they made a choice, or followed something they could not explain, and stepped out of safety without realizing it. There was no single moment where everything broke, only a gradual drift into silence. The Yuba County Five did not vanish all at once. They faded, step by step, mile by mile, until the mountains absorbed what remained. What they experienced in those final hours will never be fully known. The case is closed, the questions are not. And in the stillness of the mountains, long after the last search ended, the story remains, unfinished, unanswered, and quietly waiting.